All right.
We're good to go. Thank you. Forgive me for that. Yeah, that breakdown. Thank you.
Thank you. It works. All right. So I'm going to talk to you about British politics and China. And we're going to start with the Blair administration. So you're going to get briefly a review of the 30-year pattern in British-China relations. And as you can see from this slide, the chief driver from the British side has been economics, and in fact, an economic open door, as it's been known as official policy. And that has had problems, and you'll see the British pulling back somewhat belatedly for critics, and I'll be upfront and say I'm one of them, that this policy was somewhat naive, and events would prove that out. So I have to go quickly through this history because there's so much to pack into 30 minutes. So go back 30 years pretty much to Tony Blair's administration. He, progressive and explicit progressive. He criticized the Conservatives for being too closed to China in particular, and therefore missing out on economic opportunities, and also stoking tensions between the countries. Same policy was followed by Gordon Brown. They're both in red because they represent the Labour Party, which is an explicit progressive party. But then they were replaced by Conservatives, and the Conservative Party is, at least on economics, more on the progressive side, certainly by American standards. And so you certainly had two Conservative premiers, Conservative with a big C, the Conservative Party premiers, who were progressive in probably most things, but certainly on economics. And they continued this economic open door. So that gets us to I'll pick up with Cameron's administration to illustrate this. So it's somewhat predictable that a Labour Party would take this policy position, somewhat more nuanced that a Conservative administration would do that. But David Cameron, really a progressive, took the Conservative Party much more progressive than certainly when it lost power in 1997. In detail, the policy under David Cameron was to allow China to pretty much invest in anything. So there had been security justified barriers on Chinese investment in all sorts of things, what we would know in United States government terms as critical infrastructure. But from 2014, David Cameron essentially dropped those barriers, and the material incentives are clear. Chinese investment, foreign direct investment in technical terms, was worth $14 billion. Back then, that was worth close to 25 billion United States dollars. Sorry, did I say $14 billion? 14 billion pounds worth, about pushing 25 billion US dollars at that time. The pound has collapsed since then. David Cameron's partner in this policy was the Chancellor George Osborne, another progressive. They announced a golden era, so they escalated this policy, this open door policy. I mean, it escalated. It was sort of iterative for political reasons. They didn't open the door all at once, but they did it iteratively. And 2015, the Chancellor made a visit President Xi himself in China and announced this golden era of open economics. And the justifications were all about trade, and there was this collective policy of ignoring the security implications. Security implications are quite in contradistinction to US policy, even under progressives like Barack Obama. So the United States government was much less interested in Chinese investment in critical infrastructure. 2015, President Xi made his first official visit to the United Kingdom, and the trade deal reached there was even bigger, 40 billion pounds in commercial deals, including some with defense implications. So the escalation from 2014 to 2015 was to essentially allow Chinese import of what the United States government would consider dual use technologies, such as microchips. 2016, Britain became the first Western power to sign up to China's Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which prompted huge protests from the United States government. That policy has been reversed since then, but it was a shock, certainly to the United States government, and frankly, a lot of conservative backbenchers at the time. Right, so David Cameron loses his job in 2016 over the Brexit referendum. He backed Remain. He lost the referendum. He stepped down as he had promised before, but one of his loyal deputies takes over, and that's Theresa May. David Cameron goes on as a private citizen to take the chair of an investment fund funded solely, almost solely by Chinese money. And his explicit strategy is to cooperate with the Chinese through their Belt and Road initiative to invest monies in both Britain and China. And that obviously created concerns about conflicts of interest, particularly over Huawei, which we'll see in a moment. So Huawei UK was led by pretty much only principals from David Cameron's administration, civil servants as well as political appointees. So there was at least the appearance of what would you call it? Unseemly, at minimum, unseemly relationship between ex-government officials and the Chinese government. 2018, Theresa May goes to China and signs a new commercial deal, so a package of commercial deals worth £9 billion. And she also promised a joint trade and investment review with intent to create a wider trade deal. And the implication there that it would be a sort of a formal trade agreement where both countries abandon tariffs. They promise not to impose tariffs on each other except like for like. And note that the language there, joint trade and investment review, has this very defense military connotation that the Conservative administration had committed through legislation to quadrennial defense reviews. And the language was reminiscent of that. So that will take you up to 2018. And I've got a couple of maps here to show you the scale of the British economic relationship. So during the years from 2000 to 2018, Britain was the top recipient within Europe for Chinese foreign direct investment. That was true from 2000. The map is showing you the scale from 2008 to 2018. Second comes Germany. Germany actually has a bigger economy than Britain. So Britain was outperforming Germany in terms of foreign direct investment. There's nothing wrong in foreign direct investment. The criticism was that it was not being filtered in a secure way. And we'll see that certainly with Huawei. Another way to look at Chinese FDI is in the actual critical infrastructure with security implications. So you can see in this map, this is again for 2018, lots of football teams which don't necessarily have security implications, although I'll just note that football teams tend to have this bad reputation for being vessels for foreign bribery of British politicians. But you'll see some more obvious security concerns, such as the nuclear power plant at Hinkley Point. The Chinese had intent to own a majority stake. They've since been cut out of that. Solar farms, wind farms, and offshore oil, gas drilling. So there were these at least economic security implications, if not political security implications. So Theresa May, she gets deposed July 2019 over Brexit, or she failed to implement Brexit and engaged in a lot of dirty practices that eventually brought it down. So she was committed to implementing Brexit while she was signing Britain back into EU initiatives. Boris Johnson, who was certainly a Brexiteer, right before the referendum, he was committed to Brexit. So he takes over the Conservative Party, generally considered a conservative rather than a progressive, but on economics, he doesn't change much. Right? So in that sense, he's a sort of continuity progressive on the economics, although certainly on international politics, certainly on security, foreign policy, he's certainly a conservative, but he was much more interested in foreign policy and security, and therefore that helps to explain the policy confusion on the economics. So his backbenchers eventually will bring him down. There are lots of reasons for that, including personal scandals. But one of the reasons is the confusion on his economic policy and domestic policy in general. He just wasn't that attentive to domestic policy. However, things go well for him at first, right? He wins a landslide in December 2019 on the promise of getting Brexit done. He gets Brexit done nominally at the end of January 2020. And then in that sense, he should have had the bandwidth to turn to other things than Brexit, although the normal Brexit actually isn't. It's like it just triggers a transitional period where things are still being negotiated. So actually 2020 goes by, and then Boris Johnson's premiership's not going to last much longer than that. So he doesn't get much done. That's partly his personal character and partly the ridiculous conflicts about Brexit. So 2020, we've got this cutoff point just to show you this data. One of the facts that emerges in 2020 that starts to discredit this long policy of opening up to China on the argument of economic benefits is that China's actually it's not as important to British trade as previous administrations cared to imagine it. So you can see it's important, but given the size of the Chinese economy, it ranks lower than Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, and there are good reasons for that. You can see there's lots of neighbors here. Britain has easier trade with its neighbors than it does with China. And then traditionally, it's always been American faced, even when it was a member of the European Union. It always had much more to benefit from the American economy than it did from the European Union economy. So China, I'm not saying it wasn't important to the economy, but certainly many people had the impression from government spin that China was absolutely vital. China was replacing the European Union. Having left the European Union, if we didn't have China's trade, there would be no British economy, and that wasn't true. And then the second fact that emerged was that the Chinese share wasn't increasing proportionally as a proportion of British trade, significantly compared to how the other traditional trading partners were increasing. So this, for people who are paying attention, by 2020, the economic argument is starting to slip. More importantly, in terms of popular culture and journalistic attention, Huawei becomes this what would you call this lightning rod for criticism of the open door policy. So Huawei from 1998, so remember this is the second calendar year of the Blair administration. the policy had been through at least the early years of the Boris Johnson administration. So, right, remember that's 2 explicit progressives and 3 conservatives. They kept reaffirming that Huawei had a privileged, dominant position in British telecommunications, including government telecommunications, despite other countries such as Italy and obviously the United States, most strongly, refusing to entertain Huawei devices, particularly on public networks, as in publicly owned networks, because the hardware was being used to spy. So Britain was standing alone here, and it created tensions most with the Trump administration, which coincided with Boris Johnson's ascendancy. So in March 2020, the government admitted that Huawei was a high-risk vendor, as it put it, but still confirmed that Huawei would lead the transition to the 5G network. This is under Boris Johnson, remember. Backbenchers rebelled. First conservative backbenchers, they started defeating the government on its own legislation. And this year, March 2020 was really the month when COVID hit Britain, where the British government, to its credit, was one of the first to respond aggressively against China's manipulation of its exports, its COVID-related exports, and its lies on the origins of COVID. So COVID combined with Huawei really brings down this the consensus on open door towards China. So May 2020, Johnson, in concession to his own backbenchers, but including some cabinet members, he announced a review of Huawei's presence in 5G and in the government. And then quickly in July 2020, the government said it would not permit any new acquisitions, and it would move Huawei from 5G by 2027. Huawei, that policy allows Huawei to remain in networks before 5G. So Huawei remains in 4G, but the assumption was that 5G that those other networks would die out once 5G is dominant. But you can see there's still a few years for Huawei or the Chinese government to exploit malware inside its hardware, Huawei's Huawei sourced hardware. But the other issue that discredited the open door policy was Hong Kong. So in 1997, Britain's lease on Hong Kong expired. It was a 100-year lease, and it expired. Britain did not try to renew it. It surrendered it back to China, but it did get agreements on how guaranteeing Hong Kong's political semi-autonomy. So Hong Kong had its own government. It was one of those situations where Britain does the foreign policy and the local government does its domestic policy. And the China-British agreement also guaranteed democracy, at least until 2047. As you know, that's all been undermined by the so-called security laws, right, plural. There's been several security laws, right? So it's really a bundle of security laws. So 2020, remember May 2020, Johnson announces this review of Huawei, and then June, he said publicly that if China proceeded with its security law in Hong Kong, which would essentially bring down democracy and take away most of Hong Kong's autonomy, he would give residency to all the Hong Kongese British nationals overseas. I don't want to get into the BNO status, but they're not British citizens, but they have additional privileges of visiting and staying in Britain beyond normal foreign citizens, but they're not British citizens. It's sort of this in-between thing. And 2.5 million Hong Kongese were eligible for that, and Johnson was using that as a threat because those Hong Kongese would bring their assets to Britain and their skills, and that would be an economic hit to Hong Kong. China enacted the security laws anyway, and Britain did eventually follow through on that threat. I want to go briefly through the other things that happen in Hong Kong. So essentially, democracy was brought down. China was not intimidated by British threats. I mean, Britain could not really influence China apart from stealing its British nationals overseas. It didn't have it. China is not dependent on foreign imports to any significant degree. Certainly not from Britain. It likes certain technologies, but it's not dependent on British exports. So the threat was not sufficient. The dismantling of Hong Kongese democracy went ahead. And I'll skip over that, and we'll get to the backlash in Britain. So we get to 2021 now. So January, Johnson faces another rebellion from his backbenchers in alignment with the opposition parties, where Johnson comes up with his own trade bill, which is aimed at China but other countries. It's a post-Brexit trade bill. It's trying to simplify or free up the British government's, the executive's powers to make trade deals with foreign countries, which are just ridiculously slow and complicated in the British government. Human rights being one of the constraints, right? So it's difficult to make trade deals with countries that are not full democracies. So Johnson tries to put a trade deal through which relieves the government of lots of things, including the human rights restrictions. There are other things like you've got to have an extradition treaty and stuff like that. Those backbenchers they align with the opposition, try to put an amendment in that says the UK would be forced to abandon trade deals with countries guilty of genocide, so found guilty by an international court or by a British court. Johnson narrowly defeats that, but the rebels are not going to go away. The next month, coincidentally, this decision had been brewing for a number of years, but it was just coincident in time. So that made the public pay a lot more attention to China. Ofcom, which is the regulator of radio and television, essentially, and social media in Britain, it's a regulator. It banned a Chinese English language news channel from broadcasting in Britain on the nominal discovery that the network is controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. It always had been. So there's some suspicion that the timing was convenient to the Johnson administration and sort of a sop to the rebels saying, yes, we are tough on China. Please pass the trade bill. However, the rebels are not appeased, and they say they're going to defeat the next time the bill is put to a vote in Parliament. So the government avoids that vote by adding its own amendment, essentially, where it says a parliamentary committee will review claims of genocide. So it avoids a legislated ban on trade deals with countries that are found guilty of genocide. It allows the parliament to decide those claims of genocide, and essentially, and that's somewhat fair because the legislature makes the law. It should decide whether to execute the law on a case-by-case basis, and that relieves the government of having to be checked by the judiciary. That amendment and other things are implemented in the law, and it becomes law by royal assent in April. So it is current law. Now, there's a dispute with the EU on how to handle China. Through 2021, the European Union does not impose any sanctions on China. So if Britain has an open door, it had an open door when it was a member of the EU and in alignment with the EU. And in fact, Britain at that time would have found it difficult to diverge from EU policy because the European Union is supposed to have a common foreign policy, including on trade. So it would have been difficult. Britain was actually more aggressive in opening its door than the European Union. One of the explanations for that is the European Union is very slow in its decision making, rather than different in its decision making. So anyway, you get Brexit in 2016. That doesn't really get implemented to 2021. So it becomes an issue of divergence towards the end of 2020, which is December 2020 is when the January 2021 nominal Brexit becomes formally agreed. Now, in that same month, the European Union reaches in principle what it calls an investment deal, which is really a trade deal. It's focused on foreign direct investment, and it includes some nominal protections against Chinese intellectual property theft and so forth. So it prohibits China from forcing intellectual property transfers, forcing joint ventures with Chinese firms in order for these foreign firms to do business in China. The language of that was effectively unexecutable in practice, but it was, those are otherwise reasonable principles. It allowed Chinese staff of the foreign company to reside in the European Union for 3 years at a time, which had been opposed by plenty of people because it allowed for at least economic espionage, if not other things. And then there was this principle that China should make continued and sustained efforts to ratify 2 international labor organization conventions against forced labor. The thought was of the Uyghurs in particular. So the European Union claimed it had these protections. These protections are not actually enforceable. So there was a lot of criticism, particularly in Britain, that the European Union was diverging from the stronger British approach. So the EU-China investment deal does go ahead. This is coincident with more protests in Hong Kong. Now, Lord Patten, who was the last British governor of Hong Kong, he said, and a progressive member of the Conservative Party, but definitely a progressive, said the European Union should not ratify this deal because of discrimination against the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong. The European Union Parliament itself denounces the deal's lack of protection. So the European Parliament says what I just said about the prohibitions on and protections built into the trade deal as being unenforceable. So in effect, de facto, they're not protections. De jure they are, but de facto they're not. One of the big problems was this lady, Sabine Weyand. She had been an advisor, not elected. She becomes the Director General for Trade in the European Commission, which is the unelected executive of the European Union. And she said in response to these criticisms, she said it in English, I do not underestimate the huge challenge we have to bind China into a rules-based system. We don't have an alternative, right? There is no alternative to engagement. So this is a false binary position. You say you're either engaged with China or you're not dealing with China. Well, you either have either have a de facto open economic relationship with China, or you're disengaged with China. That's a false choice, a false binary choice. But that was the European Union's position at the time. Now that's going to change. 2021 was a big year for change, and the Uyghurs, increasing popular cultural attention to the Uyghurs everywhere, in America too, would change policy pretty much everywhere. And so this is an example where popular culture and then a popular movement really was not sufficient, but was necessary to changes of policy. The European Union, Britain, United States, and Canada, they coordinated all sorts of travel bans and asset freezes on individual persons for being involved with the abuse of Uyghurs. So they were either profiting or they were part of the official exploitation of Uyghurs, imprisoned Uyghurs as essentially slave labor. China doesn't back down. This is President Xi's administration. He doesn't back down. He doesn't compromise. He just escalates, which is not working out well for him, but that's his pattern. China retaliated, so it sanctioned various EU officials and 9 British politicians, lawyers, academics for disinformation. Classic word of international dispute these days, and domestic political dispute for that matter. Britain retaliated by withdrawing an invitation to Parliament for China's ambassador. So this is certainly cooling of relations and quite a contrast to the open door. So remember, this is 2021. Also in 2021, Britain essentially cuts all UK aid to China, apart from the small part which is purely for human rights work. China is one of those recipients of aid where a lot of critics of British foreign aid policy say, it's a strong economy and you're selling us this relationship in order for us to benefit from its economy at the same time you're aiding that economy. So it's somewhat a hypocritical policy anyway. It's a legacy of Tony Blair's administration, where that administration actually legislated that a certain percentage of GDP has to be spent on aid, and you can imagine that the incentive then was to spend it pretty recklessly, just to hit that percentage of GDP. So Britain does no longer sends aid to China, apart from human rights work, which China doesn't welcome. All right, so let's quickly transition to the defense security implications of all this. So really focused on economics. So think of the economics I've talked about as drivers of the open door policy, and then it's undermined by betrayals, that revelations, I should say, that the economic benefits are not as strong as they are, and also the economic benefits are causing administrations to overlook other things of value to Britain, such as human rights. Then there are the defense security implications, which we haven't talked about yet. Back in 2020, that's the year of COVID, remember, and where most countries are reevaluating their relationship with China, or certainly their trust of China. The First Sea Lord, who is essentially the leading sailor in Britain, he made this public comment that the Northern Sea route, which was opening up because of warming seas, the Northern Sea route around Russia, which Chinese and Russian warships exercise on, they're cooperating, opening this route, and also they train military offensive operations on that route. It makes the journey from China to the Atlantic 10 to 12 days quicker than going through the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea and then the Mediterranean. So that makes trade with China quicker in the summers, but it also implies quicker application of Chinese naval force against Europe and in principally Britain, because Britain has responsibility in NATO for North Sea security. So the gap into the Atlantic is led by Britain. There are other naval forces that protect that gap, but Britain leads that effort. So that's coincident with a British decision under Boris Johnson to make the seas around China the principal operating area for Britain's new aircraft carriers, 2 of them. So the policy starts under Theresa May, where in 2018 she sends, or her administration sends, an assault ship to sail around the Paracel Islands, which China claims for itself, Vietnam claims for itself. So it's a freedom of navigation voyage. 2020, this is under Boris Johnson. Remember, this is the COVID year. So by July of 2020, Britain has very definitely changed its policy towards China. It says it's going to base one of its 2 new aircraft carriers in the Far East. Doesn't say where that's going to be. There's still no permanent base in Asia. Britain withdrew from the Asia Pacific when it withdrew from Hong Kong. The first of those aircraft carriers does make its first operational trip to the South China Sea, freedom of navigation effort. The second ship was supposed to be fully operational this year, and it was planned to send it on its first operational trip on a freedom of navigation mission, South China Sea. Its operational status has been delayed by accidents. But we can assume that British policy is to, if not base one aircraft carrier in the Asia Pacific permanently, at least to principally operate at least one in the Asia Pacific permanently. That's the assumption. Right, Britain comes out with its long-awaited security and defense review. So this is not one of the quadrennials. This was a special review. David Cameron announced it. It was like 8 years late by the time it comes out in 2021. So this is after COVID. COVID was one of the things that delayed it, but obviously the bigger delay was the British government working out what its policy should be. It wanted to delay this review until it had clarified major changes in its attitude towards China. And the text of the document is fairly explicit on China. The Britain is facing a systemic challenge. Remember that phrase, because that's going to come back. Britain is essentially categorizing China as a systemic challenge. So not as a partner anymore, not as an economic partner or a friend or anything like that. It's a systemic challenge. And it's the longest term challenge to Britain and global security. Russia is the most acute threat, meaning it's the short-term threat, but China is the long-term threat, essentially. And Britain will now focus on the Indo-Pacific, which is different to the traditional focuses, which has been on Europe through NATO. NATO is also engaged in the Indo-Pacific, right? So it doesn't mean that this policy change does not imply an abandonment of NATO. It's additional and complementary to NATO. When Boris Johnson introduced the report to Parliament, he said, we must relearn the act of competing against state with opposing values, right? So the open door policy had been, we can trade with China irrespective of its communism or its human rights abuses. They don't matter. It's all about the economics. And in due course, the progressive argument was China will democratize and liberalize in the interests of trade. Trade is liberalizing, and China will want to liberalize to gain more trade from liberal democracies that will then trust it. So that's a change. The document also says Britain will invest in enhanced China-facing capabilities. Now, that relates to things you should have heard about, like AUKUS, which is attack submarines to defend the Indo-Pacific region from a huge surface fleet it's the largest navy in the world, much larger than the US Navy. Okay, there are qualitative differences, but it is the largest navy in the world, and one that is fairly aggressive in its encroachments into foreign fishing areas, and particularly in the South China Sea into Vietnamese, Philippine exclusive economic areas. China is listed in that document as a systemic competitor. I said, remember that phrase, because there becomes this dispute about whether to formally upgrade it to a threat. So the person who supports upgrading it to a threat is Liz Truss. When she was Foreign Secretary under Boris Johnson in 2022, she was very hawkish on China, and there were some news gathering events such as summoned the Chinese ambassador to protest about China's aggressive actions against Taiwan, such as flying aircraft through its airspace and sending warships through its sovereign maritime channels. Also in that month, August of 2022, she refused Chinese acquisition of certain companies. The British companies themselves were happy to sell to Chinese companies, but the British government stepped in. So one of them was a semiconductor plant, actually Britain's largest semiconductor plant, which has clear national security implications. All of that is contrary to the open door policy, which pretty much said China can invest in whatever it wants, including nuclear power plants. Then when she becomes prime minister in September of 2022, she says she intends in the new parliament to designate China as a threat. So an escalation from systemic competitor. Now, her premiership doesn't last long. It lasts a couple months at best. Rishi Sunak takes over in October of 2022, and he abandons this intent, which creates problems with his backbenchers, but that's a matter of record. And I don't think he's going to change anything before the next election. He's running out of time. The next election is coming up next year, and it doesn't look good for the Conservative Party. We'll just briefly talk about AUKUS. So AUKUS is a long story. It goes back before 2022, but I just want to talk about Rishi Sunak's involvement in this. So April of 2022, which is 6 months before Rishi Sunak takes over the premiership, AUKUS, meaning Australia, Britain, and the United States, they announced they're going to co-develop hypersonic weapons and counters. So the AUKUS agreement starts as cooperation on submarines, and then it gets expanded to cyber and AI and hypersonic weapons, meaning mostly hypersonic glide vehicles for essentially indefensible subgalactic nuclear weapon carriers, right? So that you would not be able to defend them against them with normal ballistic missile defenses. Then in March of this year, Rishi Sunak goes to San Diego to specify a new version of AUKUS. AUKUS started as this submarine deal. It essentially gets sped up and expanded. So the original deal was for Britain to build submarines, nuclear-powered attack submarines. They are not, by the way, carrying nuclear missiles. They're nuclear-powered attack submarines to replace the diesel submarines that the French were going to supply. Nuclear-powered, quieter, stealthier, and they can loiter longer under the ocean. So Britain was going to supply these to Australia. To speed things up, the US agreed to transfer up to 5 Virginia-class nuclear-powered submarines. Britain would build one by 2039, and then it would transfer technology and help to build a shipyard capable of in Australia capable of building the rest of the family, the rest of the submarines in that class, a new class of submarine. And then from 2027, Britain and the UK will increase sub-patrols in that region, again to cover the gap before Australia has built all the submarines it wants to cover its own naval security. Okay, so Rishi Sunak is playing a bit of an ambiguous game. So he's strong on AUKUS, but he's unwilling to certainly escalate his criticism of China. He's playing all sorts of ambiguous games. He's a bit like Boris Johnson in many ways, that he is indecisive. He doesn't like commitments. And it adds to this image that we have of the administration today and conservative administration since David Cameron, that they're full of contradictions. They don't get things done. And people don't know what they stand for. They certainly don't stand for conservatism. What do they stand for? It's a mix of stuff, from traditional socialist policies to conservative policies. But mostly it's indecisive. It just doesn't get anything done. So it starts to get more backbench criticism. This criticism is from a backbench committee. So all committees of parliament are backbench. They don't have cabinet members on them. They're backbench, right? So they're not technically part of the administration. They are. This is where the legislature is acting as a check and balance on the executive. This report's from July 2023. The Intelligence and Security Committee criticizes the government for having an inconsistent policy on China. So it has the Rishi Sunak administration has essentially inherited a more hawkish policy from Boris Johnson of 2020 onwards and Liz Truss of 2022, but has played an ambiguous game, has not followed through on various commitments, and particularly on Chinese espionage. So the British government has failed to close Chinese espionage. You might have seen just last month a an alleged Chinese spy was indicted. Who he had a long-standing job in Parliament, serving a member of Parliament. And this is an example of what the Intelligence Committee was criticizing, that the government had warnings but wouldn't act on them implicitly so as not to offend China. Right, this brings us up to September. Rishi Sunak waits until September to respond to that report, and he continues to play this double game. So he is reported by the BBC as saying China poses a threat to the British way of life. So he says it's a threat to the way of life, but he does not escalate China from a systemic challenge to a threat in defense and security terms. Right. So he's playing a duplicitous game. It helps him to avoid fashionable criticism in the media and from the opposition parties that you're conflictual, that you're causing tension, that you're going to ruin our economic relationship. He avoids that criticism, but at the same time he's sitting on the fence. So he gets criticism certainly from his own backbenchers on this. So we're in this ambiguous period in British policy towards China where this administration is treading water. It seems that most members of the administration itself think that they're going to lose the next election, and that would be my bet. It's probabilistic the Conservatives are going to lose. The Labour Party will form a government, and Labour Party will be friendlier to China, although we should point out that it won't be as friendly as the Blair and Brown administrations. We don't know because Keir Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party, has not spelled out his policy on China. So we're making bets on what it will be. But you can bet, I think you can bet, there'll be a Labour government in 2024, about a year from now, that will be friendlier towards China on economic justifications. And it may do some very symbolic things, such as degrading China as a systemic challenge. It may stop using that phrase and use a different phrase. And that will, we'll see how that goes. All right, let me stop there.
Bruce, that was fantastic. Thank you. Went a little bit over, but worth every additional comment.
I apologize.
I'm gonna not at all. We've really got we've got a cushion. As long as you don't mind if we keep you a little bit longer, we can go about 20 minutes if that's okay with you.
Yeah.
We'll shut down at 6:45 our time. But go ahead and hopefully I can handle this properly on Zoom, better than I handled the recording. So go ahead and put a hand up if you've got a question, and we can go from there. Bruce, why don't I do the first one while I'm waiting? Do the British have a? You talked about Liz Truss stepping up rhetorically with respect to Taiwan. But did anything tangibly come out of a British, warning, or anything in terms of the British making progress on having a home porting capability or an infrastructure in the Indo-Pacific that would give meaning to British threats to back down from, coercing Taiwan?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So there is nothing in the public domain about any progress on the infrastructure. I'm sure there have been negotiations with Singapore and Australia about basing an aircraft carrier in either of those countries. I think the likelier country to do would be Australia. Singapore would be geopolitically, that would be more advantageous to do it in Singapore. But Singapore has some parochial problems with foreign basing, such as it has a ban on nuclear powered vessels in its ports, and most of the warships that would be of significance to send are nuclear powered. Australia has just embraced nuclear powered submarines, having had no nuclear powered vessels before, so it would be easier in that policy sense to base in Australia. However, Australia has its own problems in selling a more hawkish policy against China. So Australia certainly went hawkish before Britain did, and it had more provocations to go hawkish, more espionage scandals, more trade wars before Britain did. But it's still its politics are largely progressive, and it's the progressive wing of Parliament which tends to it finds it too easy to say that any challenges to China are warmongering or old-fashioned and conservative, even when the administrations are not conservative after all. So Australia has its own balancing act in escalating its cooperation with foreign partners in a way that's explicitly anti-China. It is explicitly anti-China, but that's where I think we'll get. I should say that's where I think Britain will get. It'll base an aircraft carrier in Australia, or at least it'll have free porting rights in Australia. That's where I think it'll get. Singapore, Singapore's got its own concerns about Chinese expansionism, so Singapore may change its policy on nuclear powered vessels in its ports. And then the other part you asked was on Taiwan. So Britain has sent more military personnel advisors to Taiwan since Liz Truss made those comments to China, official comments to China about its aggression towards Taiwan. And in line with the United States sent more advisors, and then it released certain export controls which allowed more anti-aircraft, anti-ballistic missile systems into Taiwan, for instance, upgrades to its tanks and stuff like that. And there are certainly British advisors in Taiwan. So Britain is involved in that sense. And Britain has incorporated, with its minor vessels, it has incorporated Taiwanese waters into its freedom of navigation sailings. Usually they're on their way to India or Australia via Taiwanese waters, although the United States is doing the heavy lift on that. So there are practical implications which will pay dividends if the British government wants to escalate its cooperation with Taiwan. It will have at least some institutional memory, some current interpersonal relationships which it can exploit on that, if that's sufficient.
Yeah, if I could just follow up for a second. I'm glad that Australia is returning a little bit of the strategic favor by maybe allowing a carrier to port. But it seems like a lot of the argument you've made is, has a commercial foundation. And when I read about AUKUS, I see these numbers that are mind-boggling, like $268 to $368 billion program, which I don't even know how Australia can afford it. Like their entire GDP. But when you showed the one slide of the British being involved for one sub of the presumably 8, with the US getting, what was it, 3 to 5, and eventually the Australians building a few of their own, Can you give us an idea what the economic value? I mean, how much economic value is in AUKUS for the British, or is that really
Well,
an icing
yeah,
on the cake of the strategic value?
yeah. So, well, obviously, defense acquisitions have a trickle-down economic value, particularly if you're building weapons in your own country. That's why Australia wants to build most of those submarines with British technology in its own country. So there is an economic impact on that. But the three principal countries involved here have sold AUKUS mostly for the indirect economic benefits of investing in cybersecurity and AI. So, it's difficult to quantify how impressive those dual use economic benefits would be, but particularly on AI, there's the promise is that there'll be lots of spin-offs. Um, I'm somewhat skeptical of that myself, but that's how that's good political diplomacy to say that um, this is a defense deal with bigger economic benefits than the value of the defense deal itself. There's some truth to that. But defense isn't always economically beneficial. Australia has clearly made a decision some years ago that China is so threatening that it must uh, compromise on some of its traditional values. It's pretty much it. Australia had an open door economic policy towards China, which it doesn't have anymore. And part of that is China's fault because it has retaliated against Australian criticism of COVID, China's conspiracy to hide the truth about the origins of COVID, and China's retaliated by banning Australian bauxite, for instance, and other Australian exports. So their economic relationship is damaged by both parties' actions. But Australia has made a choice, and it's going to put its security first. And lots of countries have done that. Japan has made the same choice. Uh, there are a few countries that have not made that choice. I mean, some exceptions are like the Solomon Islands, which has given up its economic relationship with America in order to accept Chinese warships into its ports. But that is an outlier in that region.
Okay, Bruce, thank you, thank you, thank you. Um, Eric's actually in the Marine Corps, so I'm not sure if he's planning on being in Darwin in the near future. But Eric, do you have a question you want to throw toward Dr. Newsome?
Hey, Dr. Newsome, yeah, thanks for coming to talk to us tonight. I did kind of have a question about kind of the increased maritime patrols by the British in the South China Sea. Was that kind of pushed by the United States at all, since that's been a big United States military initiative for the past couple of years, or was that like a purely British
Yeah.
initiative?
No, it was largely an American initiative. So the Australians obviously had argued for both Britain and the United States to increase their naval patrols until some stage where Australia has the naval capacity to protect its own seas. There are ongoing violations of Australian fisheries, for instance, and then Australia takes responsibility for the naval security of its neighbours, such as East Timor uh, and what am I missing? Papua New Guinea, right? So Australia has naval responsibilities beyond its own waters, particularly towards the north, which is getting closer towards China. So Australia had always asked Britain and the United States, particularly the United States, to step up. And then the US has for a long time put pressure on all sorts of allies, not just Britain, but the Philippines, to step up and do more of their own patrolling to relieve the pressure on the United States Navy. So Britain, Britain's responded, to its credit, there is some consensus. I was talking earlier about there's going to be a change of political party, a very different political parties probably going to take over government, but there is broad consensus across the British mainstream parties that China does need to be contained and that previous administrations have failed to contain it. So I don't see a change under a Keir Starmer administration. I don't see a change in this commitment to increase British naval patrols in the region. And I certainly, personally, I support that commitment.
Thank you.
Could there be a change of with a change of government to Labour? Could you see a change in the British contribution to the war in Ukraine?
No, I'm going to bet no. It's possible, but the war in Ukraine is less controversial in Britain than it is in America. And that's not because Britain hasn't made huge material investments. Britain is the second largest supplier in value terms of aid, military aid to Ukraine. It's just less controversial there. One of the reasons was Boris Johnson himself, who's very strong and he was very articulate, very Churchillian in his inspirations in how he articulated the need to contain Russia. And Russia is closer to Britain, and Britain has more of a recent history of Russian violations of its airspaces and sea spaces, assassinations on British soil, including with radiological weapons of Russian dissidents. These violations have persuaded the public that Russia is a bad actor under Putin, at least. So it's just less controversial that Ukraine should have British support. Britain clearly led the initiative to send Western tanks to Ukraine. Britain was saying, we don't want to do it unilaterally. Germany come in, and then the US came in. The US put pressure on Germany, and then all three countries sent tanks of their own national manufacture towards Ukraine. Britain was leading that. Britain was leading in the supply of anti-tank missiles. Britain has led that, and there's been good consensus on that. I don't see that going away, even under Keir Starmer's administration, because Keir Starmer's Labour Party certainly continues to hold very left-wing members of Parliament. But what is often forgotten about the Labour Party is it's always been suspicious of Eastern socialism. So even when you had the strongest manifestation of British socialism was under Clement Attlee in the 1940s, when it nationalized the railways and the steel industry, and it was a socialist administration, but it was extremely antagonistic to Russian communism. So the Labour Party does have this traditional nationalism about British socialism. It's British socialism, antagonism to foreign socialisms, which has left it with a justifiable skepticism of Russia as the major part of the USSR, and then the major inheritor of the USSR. So, a lot of Americans make the assumption that the Labour Party is going to be pro-Russian. There in fact is a history of some members of the Labour Party spying for the Soviets and for Russia, but the Labour administrations have been aligned with conservative administrations in their skepticism of Russian expansionism, and so yes, I don't see Britain's support for Ukraine changing significantly.
Other questions, guys? I'm tempted to segue to the French. I mean, the French left. Not that I follow that closely, but I'm pretty sure that like Mélenchon, and certainly historically the French Communist Party, it was sort of like Moscow give us our latest instructions. But
Yeah,
if I
and the
can,
Italian and the
yep,
Greek. Yeah,
very, very. I mean, I guess it makes sense that if Jeremy Corbyn was a Trotskyite, the French communists were Stalinists. But I want to say back
yeah,
in the Tony Blair day, he met with Chirac. I mean, not a leftist guy, but I thought that they really had a breakthrough on French and British collaboration at least at the nuclear level. This Saint-Malo summit. Has anything come of that? Have the French and British nuclear relationship have the weapon relationship is anything really evolved in 25 years from that summit?
yeah, yeah. So the greatest material product of that relationship was actually signed by David Cameron, and that is it's an agreement for French and British naval aircraft to operate off each other's carriers in not necessarily even joint operations, but it's a sort of redundancy of capacity. Britain was building at that time 2 aircraft carriers. 2 doesn't give you much redundancy, right? You really need 3 to keep one on station all the time. So two's not great. So there was this self-interest for both countries to share each other's aircraft carriers in a sense. That commitment hasn't been tested operationally, but it's if you think about it, it's a hell of a commitment. But traditionally, France is that member of NATO which doesn't play nice with other members. Short of small counter-terrorist operations, France doesn't really show up to the NATO exercises, and it doesn't like to have other NATO forces pass through its airspace. Even, it's very unilateral, even though it stays a member of NATO. So, from France's perspective, this carrier relationship is quite spectacular, and certainly David Cameron was surprised when he achieved it. On the nuclear side, the civilian nuclear power has a strong Anglo-French relationship. So the EDF is strongly invested in British nuclear power. It's a French company, and there are no complaints about the national security implications of that. So in theory, I think implicitly, both countries feel that has a defense implication, in the sense that if America was ever to cut off Britain from nuclear material, Britain could source it either in its own wholly British nuclear plants or in French plants. Remember, nuclear power is not my specialty, but there are all sorts of species of nuclear material, and some species are good for different forms of propulsion and weaponization. And so France has particular species of nuclear material which Britain doesn't, and America doesn't, and or America has everything, but Britain and France, they have different species of nuclear material, and that help that. So you've got that sort of redundancy of capacity if you want to weaponize or utilize different materials. But another example is depleted uranium projectiles. They're used as anti-armor projectiles. Depleted uranium is essentially spent uranium. It's an excellent penetrator, much better than any steel alloy, and that is sourced in America. But in theory, French nuclear plants have the the nuclear species which would substitute for that, for instance.
If I could ask one question before I say goodnight, are you more are you more worried about or let's put it this way, are you less worried about the security implications of a Labor victory next year than you are about the outcome of the US election in 2024?
No, I'm more concerned about the British election. There are more uncertainties with a Keir Starmer administration than there would be with a Trump or a Biden administration. let's assume that Trump's going to win the Republican nomination. It's it's easier to predict what Trump's policy will be than Keir Starmer's. Keir Starmer is pretty slippery, right? He's got his own game. He's got his own balancing act to execute in the Labour Party. He's got Blairites. He is a Blairite pretty much, but he's got Blairites and anti-Blairites, and he's got some Marxists, and he's got some social conservatives. So British Social Democrats, in British terms, they are socially conservative and economically progressive. He's got his own balancing act to handle, and that makes him non-committal on a lot of things. And he is a slippery character in his own way. A former prosecutor, he was a slippery prosecutor. Very few people trust him, even within his own party. So there are much more uncertainties about what a Keir Starmer administration will look like. I think in terms of defense and security, that's where you've got stronger bets to be made on what defense and security will look like than the other policies. But even there, strange things can happen. I'm sure he will have to placate his anti-American wing. He will have to do something anti-American. I don't know what that will be, but could be making it more difficult for the United States forces to base in Britain or something like that. Yeah, that could be complicated.
Dr. Newsome, I've kept you 20 minutes over schedule. I owe you. I feel like we went from political science to engineering and now like macroeconomics, because if I remember correctly, I learned about something called a multiplier effect. And whenever I listen to you talk for an hour, I feel like I got a 5-hour like download of beautiful information. The analysis, the attention to detail.
Come on, Randy.
We just can't get enough of it. So know that another invitation will be coming your way, even though you can respond 3 strikes you're out. It's California kind of thing here. But can you guys show your appreciation to Dr. Newsome and maybe hang in there for 1 more minute? But Bruce, I'm going to let you go, and I'll be back in touch.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Good to talk to you, Randy. Take care.
Bruce,
Bye.
thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Let me cut down my recording.